ever done this. I feel like this is a real moment. My first Substack
Yeah,
video.
the whole Substack thing. Well, I feel like everybody has a Substack. So now, so you
uh,
wait next, and then okay, now, and then you go live, and then people will start to hop on, and then tell me if they, yes, everyone is coming on. Um,
Amazing.
okay, so, well, first of all, David, thank you very much for doing this, and thank you for writing your book, which I've read from start to finish, and it's very, very, very interesting. Um, So first, how are you? I mean, you've been
I'm good.
everywhere.
Yeah, it's been a busy week, but that's like exactly what you want as an author is a busy week.
Yeah.
But it's exhausting. And this is fun. I've never done a Substack video before, so I am losing my Substack virginity. Sorry.
Well, I don't know if you can see the people are jumping on, so that's very good.
Good.
So, and everyone, please do write in with questions as we go. So I want to sort of ask David, walk me through the premise behind the book, what and I know it's the story of the First Amendment under threat, but why you decided to look at this, what personally made you think this was a story to pursue?
Well, this goes back to like 2022. And so I have a small team of investigative reporters at the New York Times. And it felt like every time we were starting to look into someone powerful or a powerful institution, we were on the receiving end of threatening letters from their lawyers. And uh, this is something that most journalists have become very accustomed to.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you have experience with this as well.
Oh yes,
Um,
I've dealt
and
with
look,
many of the names in your book. Yeah,
yeah, no, I'm sure you have. Like a lot of most investigative journalists today are just kind of like, this is how it goes.
yeah,
What got me thinking about this though, and look, I work at the New York Times, and we are very well equipped to deal with that because we have a lot of money and we have good owners and we have a fantastic team of in-house lawyers. But it just got me thinking what this would be like if I worked at like a small newspaper or a community news website, or if I was on my own. And like what it would feel like or how it would affect me if I started getting threatened by these kind of big name lawyers. And so I started just calling around, and I reached out to, I don't know, probably hundreds of local journalists and local press associations and local media lawyers and publishing executives all over the country. And I just started hearing these horror stories about people not only getting threatened or getting sued, but it was driving them often kind of to the brink of financial or psychological ruin, or in some other cases, they were just kind of caving into the pressure because they didn't feel like they had a choice. And a
yeah,
lot of local news outlets operate on like a financial knife's edge, and it was safer for them, and in some cases, smarter for them, to just say, "Look, this is a threat we cannot deal with, so we're just not going to write about this person." And
yeah.
that's not
Well,
great. That's not what
I
we
would
want.
encourage. I mean, from the two stories that really stood out to me that struck a chord with me was Scott Stedman,
Yeah,
um, this sort of very entrepreneurial blogger whose partners, sort of gave up, which
yeah,
meant that he had to. And then the Global Witness team,
yeah.
because I've dealt with them a long time ago at Vanity Fair. Those were two stories that I found difficult to read. But maybe I think walk us through the background for all of this, because the background for what the standard is, um,
Yeah.
and why it's in danger, according to you, of changing.
Yeah, so the standard goes back to this 1964 Supreme Court decision called New York Times versus Sullivan. And without going into all the details about that case, the Supreme Court ruled in a unanimous decision that if you are a public figure or a public official, in order to successfully bring a lawsuit against a journalist or against anyone else who has written something negative and that you think is false and defamatory, you need to clear like a bunch of different bars. And so the first bar, obviously, is you need to prove that what the person wrote was false and that it hurt your reputation. which is kind of obvious. The second thing, though, is what's become known as the actual malice standard, which is not really, it's kind of a misnomer because it doesn't have much to do with, like, I think of malice and I think of like, you don't
Mhm.
like me. And that's not what
Yeah.
it's about. Instead, it's this kind of two-part test, which is that you need to prove as a public figure that, that basically not only the person who wrote this false and defamatory thing about you, that they either knew they knew that what they were writing was false. So in other words, they lied, or they acted with reckless disregard for the truth. So this basically, it created a much higher bar and for public figures and public officials to win these lawsuits. And the Supreme Court set that bar high for like a very deliberate reason, which is that they thought that it was important in a country that values free speech and sometimes raucous free speech that their people have breathing room to kind of criticize and investigate people who hold power in this country. And you know, if you're like run the risk of getting sued into oblivion just because you got like an innocent fact wrong or made an honest mistake, that creates a real chilling effect on people's ability to speak freely. And so the Supreme Court standard from this 1964 case, you know, it for the next 50 years or so, it had basically unanimous support on both sides of the aisle. And then Trump came along and started basing his campaign and then his presidency around, among other things, around the idea of demonizing and delegitimizing and weakening the media because the media was calling him out for a lot of things, especially calling him out for when he was lying or distorting things. And so this became kind of a conservative campaign to gut New York Times versus Sullivan. And it was brought by a lot of this campaign was like spearheaded by a lot of the same lawyers and activists who are also suing all these news outlets, ranging from big national outlets to much smaller ones all over the country. And it's picked up the support of Clarence Thomas and Neil Gorsuch, both of whom have said that they want to overturn Sullivan. And I mean, I don't know if they have the other votes that are necessary. They're certainly trying to get them. And if they do succeed in that, even if they succeed in like chipping away at this New York Times versus Sullivan standard, it will make it much harder, not just for journalists to investigate powerful people, but for like everyday citizens to have a voice in our country. And the example I give is like Sullivan protects you if you circulate an online petition against like a local real estate development company. That developer could sue you if you get any facts wrong, and the suit will get tossed out of court because of New York Times versus Sullivan. If you write a nasty restaurant review on Yelp and you get a fact wrong, that restaurant owner could sue you, but the case will get tossed out of court because of Sullivan. And it's like all sorts of things like that. And so it offers a very valuable protection again for journalists, yes, but like not just mainstream journalists, from journalists across the board, including independent people who just have a Substack or who, and
Mhm.
we're on Substack, so how appropriate. But it protects everyone is the bottom line.
So, I mean, obviously, I mean, one of the other many things in your book that I thought was interesting is that the court of the 1960s was the very, very liberal Warren
Yeah.
Court, and um, and so there will be people politically on the other side, right, who'll read your book and say, well, courts reflect times political climates in which they come to be. The times have changed. Journalism has changed. And so one of the things I thought was particularly interesting that you point out is that a very conservative legal thinker, Robert Bork, was actually very pro the Sullivan decision.
Yeah.
So why?
Because we in this country for 250 years, give or take, have placed a very high premium on people being able to speak freely and criticize the government. In fact, it's viewed as like one of the most, it's the First Amendment because it was viewed as such an important check on the power of the government and the power of the president in particular, having a vigorous, robust media and having a lot of people being able to speak freely. And Bork's point, look, one of the critiques of Sullivan has become, if you look at the 45 words of the First Amendment, libel and defamation are not among them. And people like Clarence Thomas have argued that if you go back and like study the framers' words and the debates they were having as the Constitution was ratified, you will not see them saying we should protect speech that is inaccurate or false or defamatory. And Bork's point,
Well,
and Bork is
the framers also didn't talk abortion about
No,
abortion. And,
or
there were
about
no women's rights, civil rights. Yeah.
right. Oh, and almost to me, more to the point, they certainly didn't talk about corporations having First Amendment rights to give unlimited amounts of money to sway elections, which is a First Amendment right that Clarence Thomas has very proudly celebrated. So the notion that we're going to take a super narrow vision of the Bill of Rights on the one hand, and then expand it wildly on the other, it seems very self-serving and hypocritical. But Bork's point, and Bork was like really well positioned to make this argument because he was kind of the intellectual godfather of originalism, which is this notion that you need to take a narrow look at the actual meaning and words of the Constitution as it was written. And his point was that the framers wrote only 45 words in the First Amendment, not because they didn't have more to say or because they didn't care about it, because they wanted to preserve flexibility for future generations to interpret things differently as the world evolved. And so he gives us an example, like, the framers of the Constitution didn't exist in a time where there's electricity. That doesn't mean that the government doesn't have the power to regulate electricity or that there shouldn't be rules protecting people from electronic surveillance. It just means that they didn't know there was electricity. So Bork became a very deep supporter of Sullivan and the rights that are protected, and did it from this very, I think, a really important kind of originalist perspective, which was aimed almost directly, it seemed, at refuting people like Clarence Thomas that were going to use this incredibly narrow interpretation.
And so what were the metrics? I mean, I know that you present all these different sort of case studies, as it were, that have happened in under, Trump 1,
Yeah.
Trump 2, the last decade. But were you able to sort of compare and contrast the amount of litigation that's been brought before then
Yeah.
to periods to talk about?
It's a little tricky. So the short answer is yes, but frankly, the data isn't very good. So what data does exist, first of all, it stops around 2019. So we don't know what happened post 2019. What we know is that the volume of lawsuits filed against the media, defamation lawsuits filed against the media, went up pretty sharply after Trump was basically as Trump came onto the political scene and then after he was elected. What we don't know, first of all, and the reason I caveat that is that the data is a little bit wonky in a bunch of like complicated ways, and also it doesn't. We don't have current data, so which is a handicap, right? But I can tell you, having spent 2+ years reporting on this, and also working in a major newsroom and having lots of friends who work in other big newsrooms, like so anecdotally, this stuff is going through the roof. I mean, there are on a daily basis, there are journalists all over the country at ranging from the New York Times and the Washington Post down to people who just have like a YouTube show or a podcast that are being threatened, receiving letters threatening them if they do not either remove or delete or kill stories that powerful people, again, whether it's a local real estate development company or the president of the United States, uh, have problems with. And another measure of this, in addition to just me anecdotally hearing about a lot of these instances, is that there's been this kind of proliferation of a cottage industry of lawyers, really, whose sole purpose is to threaten and sue the media on behalf of, generally speaking, very rich and powerful clients. And that's something that just did not exist 10 years ago. That's something that's really sprung up in response to this greater demand to issue these threats and bring these lawsuits. And it's become, I think, kind of a automatic and core part of like the public relations strategies the big companies, for example, or celebrities use when they're facing some sort of crisis. And one of the weapons at their disposal is going to be first to threaten a lawsuit, and then if they don't get their way and that doesn't work, file the lawsuit. And they're very low costs on their side to using those tactics. And the costs for the journalists or uh, whoever else is doing the unfavorable speech, the costs for them are often just astronomical, at least relatively speaking, and unaffordable.
What about, is one of the messages that, independent journalists really must take out insurance?
Well, that's the problem. Like, good luck doing that. I mean, yes, they should if they are doing kind of like, I think, aggressive and ambitious investigative reporting. Yes, they should, but it's extremely hard to do that. And most insurance carriers I've found will not insure independent journalists. And I'm sure there are plenty of exceptions to that. But one of the things, and I think this is a core part of the strategy to weaponize these laws and to suppress speech, is that people have figured out that if once you've faced a lawsuit, let's say you have insurance, you face a lawsuit, you win the lawsuit. There's not, the court rules for you. When your insurance comes up for renewal, you are either not going to be able to renew the insurance, or the prices, the rates that you pay for that
Mm.
insurance are going to skyrocket. Your deductible is going to skyrocket. And those are costs that extend for years and years into the future. And what I've found, again, especially at the local and independent level, is that where the places do not have tons of money that they're swimming around in. They're doing this, sometimes this is a kind of a sideline project. It just makes it completely unaffordable. So this trend that I'm writing about, and it's really a very concerted campaign across the country at this point, I really think it poses an absolutely existential threat to all of these kind of independent journalists and new voices that have been entering the media in the last several years, which, by the way, is like, to me, and I realize maybe this is ridiculous coming from a guy who works at the New York Times, but like, to me, that is one of the brightest spots in the media
Mm.
landscape right now. We've got all of these new voices. I don't always agree with all of them, but it's like, it's just so good for democracy to have people have low barriers to entry, so that anyone who has a good point of view and is going to work hard and say and write interesting things has the ability to be heard. And this weaponized lawfare and this campaign to narrow Sullivan, it poses an existential threat to that kind of journalism, I think.
Were there any cases where that you came across where actually the journalist had been reckless? I
Yeah.
mean, because I mean, obviously, part of the problem is for as many well-meaning, well-intentioned, and ambitious, investigative, independent journalists out there, there is also a bunch of crap on social
100%.
media. So,
100%.
so it's tricky, right? So, I mean, I mean, what did you feel sort of sorting through all of that?
I guess I felt that it wasn't that tricky ultimately. There's some very well documented cases on both the left and the right of journalists or news outlets being extraordinarily reckless and doing deep damage to people's reputations. And on the left, I think of this terrible story that Rolling Stone magazine did 7 or 8 years ago, where they claimed that there had been this rape epidemic on the
Yeah.
University of Virginia campus, and it was just garbage. And it was like wrong. They had relied entirely on one anonymous source. They had not done proper fact checking. When they had received kind of contradictory or conflicting information, they basically just disregarded it. And in the process of doing that story, among the people that were defamed by that story was a dean at the University of Virginia who was supposed to be in charge of dealing with campus rapes. And the story presented her as someone who had just tried to sweep this under the rug. And the problem was, it had never happened. And so, look, I mean, Rolling Stone got this dean sued Rolling Stone. And I think some people in the media were like, no, they shouldn't be sued. We stand for the media and the media's rights to report fearlessly. I disagree with that. Like, I think in cases where someone does something really reckless and defames someone and either knew that they were printing lies or should have known that they were printing lies, like
Or should have found out the source.
yeah, it was just completely irresponsible journalism. And so the dean won millions of dollars in damages against Rolling Stone. Again, like, I don't wish ill will toward Rolling Stone, and I'm sure I'm sure they like learned their lesson, and I hope they learned the lesson. But to me, that was a really clear example of, there are definitely legitimate defamation cases out there against major media outlets, and B, and this is where it kind of cuts against this campaign to weaken the libel laws. And that to me was a very clear example of how someone can bring a successful defamation case against the media when they get defamed. Clearly, Rolling Stone had like done a terrible job, and they were held accountable. I mean, here's another example. That's on the left. On the right,
Mhm.
look at Fox News during the 2020 election, where they had guests on and they had hosts on lying about the election results, and in particular, lying about the role that Dominion voting systems, which makes the voting machines and software that were in use in dozens of states, claiming that they were like owned by the Venezuelan government and were deliberately rigging votes in
Mm.
favor of Biden instead of Trump. And so Dominion lost all this business as a result of these lies. They sued Fox News, and as part of that lawsuit, they got, as part of the discovery process, they could go inside of Fox News's electronic communication systems, and they could see that people like Tucker Carlson were openly talking with their colleagues about how they were spreading lies. And so that's a successful defamation case, and it ultimately didn't get to trial, and Fox was forced to pay, I can't remember the exact amount, but it was like nearly $800 million in damages to Dominion. And so there's another example of reckless media outlet, person or institution that gets harmed. And under our existing libel laws, they were able to successfully bring that suit. And there are a bunch of other examples on the right and left where there's no one, no one is arguing, or at least I'm not arguing, that the media should be immune from punishment when they get things terribly wrong and do great damage to someone. I'm not. My point is that there is a strong public interest in the media being fearless as they investigate and write about powerful people, and
Mhm.
that if we feel like we're going to be sued for making innocent mistakes and getting facts wrong, like, in good faith, that is a real. It's going to make it very hard for anyone, but especially smaller news outlets and independent journalists, to write aggressively about people that hold a lot of power in our society.
Right, and obviously, since the culture is turning towards a proliferation of smaller
Yeah,
independent journalists and
exactly.
away from large platforms, it's really important. You talk, I mean, obviously, we all know I grew up in England where they don't have the
Yeah.
same standard. And I thought what you pointed out about England sort of being a Sue haven or whatever was sort of
It's
interesting.
a town called
Tell
Sioux, I
people,
think.
yeah. So I mean, I thought it was interesting because obviously the Brits, you know, I'm very proud of growing up on quote unquote Fleet Street, and we do have a very robust press, but it is a different culture, and certainly, you know, some of my books have not been published in
Yeah.
England, um, and because for the reasons that I think you point out. But one question I have for you: Did you? I mean, I have a feeling, and it's only a feeling, I haven't done any actual data work in this, that even though the standard here is to sue for defamation is higher, that there are more suits here than there are in England. I mean, am I wrong?
Well, first of all, I don't know on a per capita basis where there are more. I have not looked at the data. It's an interesting question. I mean, but one thing, and you might be right. I mean, we live in a very litigious country where for all sorts of lawsuits, not just involving the media. But I mean, look, one thing, I lived in London for a long time, and when I worked at the Wall Street Journal, and I had, before I moved there, I had really taken New York Times versus Sullivan, excuse me, and just the First Amendment in general. I think I'd kind of taken it for granted because I'd always lived here. I'd never worked overseas. I arrived in London, and within not very long, I learned about the power of British courts to issue injunctions to stop people in advance from writing about things. And then I was enjoined from writing about things. And it was not like the institution that got an injunction against me was a part of the British government that did not like what I was writing because it was going to reveal something about an investigation they were doing. But in the UK, powerful people can go there and file an application for an injunction, and courts will often grant that application, at least initially. And then there's a thing called a super injunction, and that means you can't even write about the existence of an injunction. So it's I love England. I love London. I hope to one day live there again. It's a great country. There's a million great journalists there, but it's a very different culture, and it's not a culture that celebrates free speech the way we do in this
Right.
country, for better and for worse. And uh, I personally, I think that's for worse. But I'm biased. I mean, I'm American. B, I'm a journalist. But I mean, I think it's kind of a choice that people need to make between living in a country that really values free speech above all else and allows
Yeah.
people to have the right to stand up, have the right to go protest about something you don't feel good about without fear that you are going to be punished either by the government or by someone else for doing that. And I mean, right now we're seeing, some pressure on those rights in the US. And I mean, that's scary to me.
Well, and you came under you talk about the law firm Claire Locke,
Yeah.
and I mean, walk us through what happened, because you came under pressure from them, right?
Yeah.
Well, not just writing this book, but doing a story for the New York Times.
Yeah.
Have you heard from Claire Locke since the book has come out?
Well, I haven't heard from them, but a reporter wrote a story recently, just like the other day. These days are like bleeding together this week. I cannot even remember when this was. I think maybe it might have been yesterday.
Was
It
this
was
Bill Cohen?
it was Bill Cohen at Puck
Yeah,
News. Wrote a piece about my experience with Claire Locke. He had been on the receiving end of Claire Locke's threats and
right.
lawsuits. Many American journalists have. And he went to Claire Locke for comment on my book. And of course, I had gone to comment for them on my book as well. I sent them, I mean, hundreds of questions, I'm sure, over the course of a year. And they had threatened me, and we can talk about that if you want. But what he and Claire Locke is this law firm. It's like the elite premier law firm in the United States for threatening and suing journalists and news outlets. They like boast about it on their website that they call themselves media assassins, and that is not an inaccurate portrayal, I don't think. Anyway, and one of their reputations is for really bullying people. And journalists, publishers, lawyers, they are often perceived as bullies. Anyway, so I found it quite rich that in responding when Bill Cohen asked them for comment on my book, their response was that I was bullying them, and I wasn't. I think there's an attitude with Claire Locke and other law firms like it that because they're lawyers and they work for a law firm, they don't deserve the same kind of scrutiny that anyone else does, and I just could not disagree with that more. And I think they really objected. I mean, I really got inside the law firm and wrote about some
Mm,
of the conflicts and tensions, and some of which were like quite personal, in fact. And
yes,
I,
they were.
yeah, they were. And I think it's interesting and telling. And I also think it's, look, I'm sure it was not pleasant for them to have their dirty laundry aired in public. It never is. And I don't blame them for not liking that. But, and what they did with me was what they do with a lot of people, which is they tried to deny things. Then they tried to manipulate things. Then they tried to smear me with both myself and with my employer and my book publisher. And, again, I'm lucky because I'm in a position where I work for the New York Times. My publisher is HarperCollins. These are these are places that have money and generally pretty strong spines. But I mean, I've heard of people whose book contracts sometimes go away or almost go away because of these types of legal threats. And I just think these tactics are kind of beyond the pale. So I found it very ironic that they were then calling me a bully.
Mm.
They also
I
called
read,
me a misogynist and a snake.
yes, I read. I know, I read. Well, the other thing I wanted to bring up was there's a sentence in the book that may not resonate with other people, but resonated with me when you talk about Liz McNamara, who's a wonderful lawyer who's
Yeah.
read at least she was the lawyer for one, if not two, of my books. And it was when she said about one of the cases that you bring up that the Clarence Thomas opinion. I mean, I think the guy won the case, right? The
Yeah.
journalist, but there was on the back of it this opinion from Clarence Thomas and Neil Gorsuch, or was that
Yeah, it was both of them. This is the Pulitzer
right?
versus Lawson case.
And when Liz, who's a very pragmatic, calm person, as I recall, says this sort of bodes ill or something to
Yeah.
that effect. That actually, for me, was the most chilling sentence in the whole book. I mean, did you get a sense from people like her, lawyers who do this for a living, kind of what timeline they're thinking? I mean, is this something that the court could potentially look at before within Trump's term?
I think that there's a real, just to be transparent, I think there's a real kind of divergence of opinions on this, to be honest with you. I think that you ask some media lawyers and they think, so basically right now there's two votes clearly to overturn New York Times versus Sullivan. One, Clarence Thomas and Neil Gorsuch. you need 4 votes to accept a case for review. You obviously need 5 votes to overturn it. And I don't know if there are 2 or 3 more votes. And I think there are a bunch of candidates. Alito has been on a media bashing tirade the past couple of years. We don't really know where Barrett stands. Roberts, of all people, has written back when he was in the White House, said some things that are kind of critical of Sullivan. Justice Kagan's another who, back before she became a judge, was kind of questioned Sullivan. And but I really don't. It's hard for me to handicap. And I talked to different lawyers in this space, and some are just honestly they think I'm being like way too pessimistic, and they think that Sullivan is really going to be fine. I talked to others who have a much less optimistic view of it. So, um, if I was going to guess, I think my guess would be that the court does not accept a case that's seeking to overturn Sullivan outright, but instead takes a case maybe that is looking at kind of chipping away at it around the edges. And one scenario, which again, this is just a hypothetical that I'm making up, but and one scenario would be so Sullivan applied only to public officials. It then was broadened in some subsequent decisions to apply to public figures as well. So like you're a local billionaire or a real estate developer or a restaurant owner, university president. Um, and the court could kind of narrow that group of public figures, perhaps. And so that would mean that a wider range of people that have power and influence, it would make it easier for them to sue the media and also to sue just everyday citizens if, in criticizing those public figures, you get a fact wrong by mistake. And so
Mm,
I obviously, again, I'm biased here, but I think that that would be very problematic. I think it would make it a lot harder for everyone to speak openly and kind of express their opinions and their views and facts about people that have a lot of power, because you would have to be a lot more worried that you might get sued, and that there's nothing like the threat of a lawsuit hanging over your head
mm,
to kind of even subconsciously it like filters into your thinking and your appetite for spending a bunch of time writing about something, because no one want getting I've been sued. It sucks. Like,
mm.
and again, I was not worried that I was going to lose. It was just like, and again, I have the
That's it.
backing of big institutions behind me. So it's like, that's not even, it sucked for me. It'll like really, really suck. Sorry, that's like not a nice word to say on a,
No, 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 no. But yeah,
uh,
but we're this is meant to be real and authentic. So no, I think I hear you. No, I mean there's the whole discovery hold and all the rest of it, and obviously part of the, when you mentioned the Rolling Stone story at the start of this conversation, I mean, what was really striking about them getting it so badly wrong and was that those were the days that I remember fondly with some nostalgia when if you were writing a deep dive investigative piece for a magazine like that, you had weeks,
yeah,
months, and a really rigorous fact checking process before the end product came out. Now the news cycle is so much quicker. There's so much pressure to move fast that it's even easier to write to make a mistake.
yeah.
And
And,
so,
well, go ahead. Sorry.
no, I was just going to say, I mean, that at the risk of sounding slightly sanctimonious, the onus really is on people, but not to hand over a gift horse in this environment, not to make
Yeah.
a mistake.
Well, 100%. But I think the problem is that, look, as we said earlier, like one of the great things right now in journalism is this explosion of new voices we're seeing on Substack, on social media, on YouTube, on podcasts, and but a lot of those people, and I don't view this as a problem kind of overall, but a lot of those people lack kind of formal journalism training. In fact, that
Yeah,
might be a good thing in general, right? That they are not trained in like the conventions and traditions that mainstream media journals are. But one of the real downsides to that is that I don't think they always understand what fact checking is, or like the value of having a good editor, which is always valuable.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and uh, and look, but I mean, you just kind of said this, I think, but there are a lot of people out there right now looking for opportunities to come down hard on you, and that is it's dangerous. I mean, we're seeing this, where we're really seeing this right now is with protesters, I think, where there is people are being, or student journalists at Columbia are being warned against writing about things that could get them kicked out of the country. And uh, this was not on my bingo card. It was not even a few months ago.
Mm.
And I just think that there are a lot of people out there right now, whether they work in the government or they just have a lot of money and are litigious and think that they do not deserve to be scrutinized, where they are waiting for journalists to slip up, make a mistake, so that they can get sued. And again, you do not need to win a lawsuit for it to be successful, to achieve its
Yeah.
purpose, which is to drag people and organizations through years of really expensive litigation, really stressful litigation. Sitting for depositions, not fun. Undergoing the discovery process, not fun. And again, one of the things I did with this book is, and you mentioned Scott Stedman earlier. I mean, I talked to a ton of journalists all over the country, like local and independent ones, who have been through this, and it is just grueling. And Scott spoke very openly with me about some of this, but I mean, he had to check himself into a hospital because he was having such debilitating panic attacks. He ultimately quit journalism
Mm.
because he couldn't deal with the stress of this and the financial and psychological stress of this. And I've heard that similar stuff from a lot of other people. There's some of their stories are told in this book, and it's not a good environment out there right now. And that's in a situation where we still have Sullivan, right?
Mm.
Imagine how much worse it's going to get if the Supreme Court starts chipping away at these precedents.
100%. Well, on that rather chilling note, we probably should wrap it up. But David, thank you very, very, very much. And we'll post this so people can see it later on Substack.
Thank you for doing this. This is my first time doing this. Hopefully not my last.
Exactly correct. Talk to you soon.
Okay, thank you.